The day I saved my son from losing everything, he didn't even know it was me. He was sitting across a mahogany desk in a glass-walled office in downtown Hartford, his hands folded like a man who had rehearsed calm, and the banker across from him was explaining very quietly, very precisely, exactly how far underwater he had gone. I watched through a window in the hallway. Nobody in that room knew I was standing there. Julian looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. All 6 feet of him, the custom suit, the silver watch, all of it looked like it had been pressed flat by something invisible, and I thought about the night, 10 years earlier, when he had stood on the front steps of our house in Greenwich, the snow coming down soft and steady, and told me that I was no longer welcome there. I thought about that night a lot during those years, not with anger, not anymore. I had moved through anger a long time before. What I thought about was how quiet it was, how the snow made everything hush, and how I had driven away with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, and had not once turned the car around. And now here I was, a decade later, in a hallway, about to do the thing I had come to do. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because to understand what happened in that hallway, and why I chose to do what I did instead of simply walking away, you have to understand how we got there. You have to go back to the beginning, to the house, to Julian's mother, to the 27 years I spent building something I believed in, only to watch it crumble in a single winter. So let me take you back, because this story doesn't start with betrayal, it starts with love. It always does. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me where you're watching from. Just a reminder, this is a fictional dramatization for entertainment only. It's not professional legal, medical, or financial advice. Viewer discretion is advised. Enjoy the rest of the video. My name is Arthur Whitfield, and I grew up understanding one thing clearly. You earned what you had, or you didn't really have it. My father was a civil engineer from New Haven who worked 60-hour weeks and still managed to be home for dinner on Friday nights. He kept his shoes polished. He paid his bills 2 days early. He said more than once that a man who can look his creditors in the eye is a man who can look himself in the mirror. I don't know that I ever fully appreciated those words until I was much older, but they settled into me somewhere, the way certain things do when you hear them young enough. I married Catherine when I was 29. She was 31, a landscape architect. Beautiful in that quiet, particular way that people underestimate at first and then never forget. We had our first son, Julian, in 1982. Our second son, Marcus, came 4 years later, in 1986. And if I'm honest with you, if I'm truly honest in the way that this story requires, I have to tell you that Catherine and I, from the very beginning, did not love our sons the same way. That's a hard thing to say out loud, but it's true. And it's the foundation of everything that came after, so I won't soften it. Julian was Catherine's son in every visible way. Same dark eyes, same quick intelligence, same ability to read a room and calibrate himself to it. He was charming as a child in a way that made adults unconsciously lean toward him. Teachers remembered his name. Neighbors kept his drawings on their refrigerators. At his 5th birthday party, I stood in our backyard in Greenwich and watched my wife hold his hand as he opened gift after gift. And I noticed that she was watching him the way she had watched sunrises when we were first dating, like he was the most remarkable thing she had ever seen. Marcus, by contrast, was born into the shade of that brightness. He was a quiet child, thoughtful, slow to speak, deeply feeling. He didn't perform his goodness the way Julian did. He showed it in other ways, the way he would come find you if he sensed something was wrong, the way he kept his word about small things, the way he once spent 3 weekends building a birdhouse for an elderly neighbor across the street without being asked or telling anyone. I didn't always see those things in real time. I was working. I was building the consulting firm I'd started at 34. I was in a phase of life where I mistook presence for attention, and I wasn't present enough. Catherine had a term she used, though she never said it to be cruel. She called Julian her old soul. She called Marcus her little warrior, and I watched across those early years how those labels functioned as prophecy. Julian was encouraged to lead, to speak up, to be confident. Marcus was encouraged to be careful, to not overthink, to settle down. Julian got the better bedroom on the 2nd floor, the one with the bay window that looked out over the yard, because Catherine said the light would help him concentrate when he studied. Marcus was on the 3rd floor in a smaller room, and he never once complained about it. Not once. That particular memory sits in my chest like a stone. By the time Julian was in high school, he was the undeniable center of the family, captain of the lacrosse team, high honor roll, The kind of kid who walked into college interviews looking like he'd already graduated. We sent him to a private boarding school in Western Connecticut, and I was proud of him. Genuinely proud. Though I sometimes wonder now if what I was proud of was Julian himself or the image of Julian that I had allowed myself to accept. Marcus went to the public school in town. He didn't ask to go to boarding school. Later, when he was an adult, he told me that he had assumed there wasn't money for it. There was. We just never offered. There's a specific memory I return to. Marcus was 14. He had been working on a science project about hydrology for 3 months, rivers and water tables, maps he had drawn by hand, research papers he had annotated in the margins with his neat, careful handwriting. The night of the school science fair, Catherine and I were supposed to go. Julian had a lacrosse tournament in Massachusetts that same weekend, and Catherine wanted to be there. We compromised, she and I, the way parents sometimes do, without quite realizing what the compromise costs the child who isn't consulted. We went to the lacrosse tournament. Marcus's science teacher called us the following Monday to tell us that Marcus had won first place in his category. She sounded surprised we weren't there. I told her we had a conflict. She said he waited until 9 o'clock before he let his uncle take him home. He had waited because he thought we might still come. I didn't fully understand until much later how much those moments accumulated. But we were a family. We had dinners together. We had summers at the lake house in Vermont. We had Christmas mornings and arguments and grocery runs and all the ordinary fabric of a life. And I held on to that fabric like it meant everything was fundamentally fine. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. The closing on the Greenwich property was supposed to happen on a Friday in October of 1991. I remember this because I had just finalized the acquisition of a smaller firm that would double our capacity, and Catherine was meeting with a landscaping client in Westport, and we were both, for a brief and genuinely happy week, feeling like things were exactly as they should be. Julian had just started at the University of Pennsylvania. Marcus was a senior in high school, quiet and self-sufficient as always, already accepted at a state university on an academic scholarship he had earned without any help from either of us. It was around that time, at the fall of Julian's freshman year, that I first noticed the shift in how he spoke to me. It was subtle, the way a change in weather is subtle, until suddenly you realize you've been cold for an hour. He began calling me Arthur in certain company. Not always, but sometimes in front of his college friends when they came home for a long weekend, when he wanted to signal to them that he was a certain kind of person, modern, unimpressed by his own family, he would call me Arthur instead of Dad. Catherine thought it was funny. I didn't say anything. What I didn't know was that while Julian was at Penn, he had met Tiffany. Tiffany Harmon came from money. Old money, the kind that didn't need to explain itself. Her family had a home in Darien, a place in Maine, and a last name that appeared on the side of a building at a university in New England. She was sharp, ambitious, and she had a very specific vision for the life she intended to live. I don't say this to condemn her. I have spent a long time understanding Tiffany, and I believe that most of what she did came from a place that was more fear than malice. She was afraid of sliding, afraid of ordinary. And when she looked at Julian's family, at me, I think she saw something that threatened her image of what she was marrying into. She and Julian were engaged by the time Julian was 25. By then, I was 52, and Catherine had been gone for 3 years. Breast cancer diagnosed late moved fast. The worst year of my life, and the year that changed the shape of everything that came after. Catherine died in the spring, on a morning with yellow light through the hospital window, and I held her hand and I told her that I loved her, and she said she knew, and that was the end of that. After Catherine died, the house in Greenwich was mine. We had owned it jointly, of course, the way married couples do, and her share passed to me without complication. The boys were named as beneficiaries in her will for her personal assets, her jewelry, her design library, a small savings account she'd kept in her name. Julian received more of her jewelry collection than Marcus did, because Catherine had specified it that way. I didn't contest this. I think I was too sad to analyze it clearly, but I remember Marcus sitting at the kitchen table after the reading of the will and looking at the table surface for a long time without saying anything. The house was appraised at just over $3 million at that point. I had paid off the mortgage 8 years earlier. I also had a retirement account, a pension from the consulting firm which I had since sold for a meaningful sum, and approximately $400,000 in a money market account. I was not wealthy in the Greenwich sense. I was not someone with a family foundation or a yacht or generations behind me, but I was comfortable, more than comfortable. And the house in particular felt like stability. like the thing that couldn't be taken. Julian and Tiffany were married in the summer. It was a beautiful wedding, I'll give them that. The venue was a restored estate in the Hudson Valley, white tents on a lawn above the river, 200 guests, a string quartet. I walked Julian down the aisle alone. Marcus was there, in a good suit, smiling genuinely for his brother. I remember catching Marcus's eye during the ceremony and something passing between us, something wordless and complicated, the way things sometimes are between the people who have quietly understood each other for years without ever quite naming it. Tiffany became Mrs. Whitfield on a Saturday in August. By the following March, she had begun, very graciously, very reasonably, suggesting that the Greenwich house might be better suited to a younger family. She didn't phrase it as a demand. She was too smart for that. She phrased it as concern. She mentioned over a Sunday dinner that she worried about me rattling around in such a big house alone. She mentioned property taxes, which were substantial. She mentioned that some of her friends' parents had found wonderful communities, active retirement communities, she called them, in places like Scottsdale and Boca, where the weather was warmer and the pace was more manageable. She smiled when she said it. Julian nodded along. I sipped my coffee and said that I was perfectly happy where I was. But the seed was planted, and I should have paid closer attention to the soil it was planted in. The conversation escalated over the next 18 months in small, controlled increments. There was never a single blowout, never a moment where someone stood up and said what they actually meant. It was all conducted in the language of reasonableness. Tiffany would frame her concerns as being for my benefit. Julian would nod, and then, when Tiffany wasn't in the room, would half apologize in the way of men who have made their loyalties clear without wanting to admit it. Then one evening, this was in February, cold even by Connecticut standards, Julian sat down across from me in the study and told me he and Tiffany had found a financial advisor, that they had run some numbers, that the Greenwich property, if it were sold and the proceeds invested properly, could generate a return that would more than cover the cost of a very comfortable apartment for me, that it was, from a purely financial perspective, the logical move. I asked him very carefully who had hired this financial advisor. He said that Tiffany had a relationship with them through her family. I asked him equally carefully whose numbers they had run. He looked at the fireplace. I told him that the house was not for sale, that I was 61 years old in good health, and that I had no intention of trading the home I had lived in for 30 years for an apartment in a retirement community while my son and his wife moved into my property, because that was what I understood to be the real proposal, even though nobody had said it out loud yet. Julian said I was being paranoid. Tiffany said from the doorway, she had been listening, that nobody was suggesting anything of the kind, and that I was making this much more adversarial than it needed to be. My hands were flat on the desk. I kept them flat. I said, I'd like for us to end this conversation now. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from an attorney I didn't recognize. It informed me that Julian, as co-executor of Catherine's estate, a role he held but had never previously invoked, was requesting a formal accounting of all assets related to the marital estate. The letter was full of precise legal language. It suggested, without quite stating, that there were questions about how the estate had been settled, about whether my transfer of the house into my sole name had been properly documented. I stood in the kitchen reading that letter twice. The coffee was still hot. My hands were very steady, and I thought about my father's advice about looking creditors in the eye, and I thought about the fact that my son had hired an attorney before talking to me. I called Marcus that evening. He was living in Portland, Oregon by then, working as an environmental consultant, married to a woman named Dana, who was warm and practical and good. He answered on the second ring, which he always did. I told him about the letter. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How are you doing, Dad? Not what are you going to do, or that's outrageous. Just how are you doing?" That was Marcus. I told him I was fine, that I was probably going to need a lawyer. He said he knew a good estate attorney in Hartford, someone who had helped a colleague of his with a complicated family matter, and he would send me the name. He did within the hour. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She had an office on the 3rd floor of a building near the Hartford courthouse, with large windows that looked out over a park. She was about 50, with a precise, unhurried manner, and a habit of writing things down in a narrow black notebook before she responded to anything. When I laid out the situation, the letter, the estate, Julian's role as co-executor, the property, she listened without interrupting. Then she opened her notebook and asked me to confirm some specific dates. She told me that the certified letter was, in her professional opinion, designed to unsettle rather than to litigate, that the transfer of the property had been properly executed and recorded with the county clerk at the time of Catherine's death, and that there was nothing in the estate documentation that Julian's attorney could successfully challenge. But she also told me something else. She said, "Arthur, the goal here isn't the legal letter. The legal letter is the pressure tactic. The goal is the house." I knew that. I had known it since the financial advisor conversation. She said the question was what I wanted to do, whether I wanted to fight or whether I wanted to find a resolution. I told her I wanted to think about it. I drove home that evening through the kind of grey February afternoon that makes New England feel ancient. The salt on the roads had crusted the wheel wells of my car. I pulled into the driveway of the house and sat there for a moment, looking at the brick facade, the bare oak tree in the front yard. The front door I had painted myself one spring when Julian was 10 and Marcus was 6, and Marcus had helped me, carefully, getting just a little too much paint on the brush and trying very hard not to make a mess. I went inside, I made dinner, and I began, for the first time, to think strategically. The quiet period came in May. Julian called and asked if we could have dinner, just the two of us. He came to the house, Tiffany stayed home, and we sat at the dining room table the way we used to when he was in college and came home for a weekend. He looked tired. He said that things had gotten out of hand, that he had let Tiffany's concerns drive him somewhere he hadn't entirely intended to go. He said he was sorry about the letter. I watched him while he spoke. He was 41 by then. There was grey at his temples. He had his mother's eyes, and in that moment I could see Catherine in him so clearly it almost hurt. I told him I accepted his apology. I told him that what mattered to me was that we understood each other going forward, that the house was not a negotiating point, that I had put 30 years into that property and into this family, and I would not be managed out of my own home. He nodded. He said he understood. He ordered the fish at dinner, which he always ordered when he was trying to seem reasonable. I almost believed him, and part of me, the part that still looked at him and saw the 5-year-old at the birthday party, the 10-year-old holding the paintbrush, the boy with his mother's face, wanted to believe him enough that I was slower than I should have been to see what was actually happening. 3 months later, in August, I came home from a week visiting Marcus and Dana in Oregon to find a locksmith's card tucked into the front door frame, and when I put my key in the lock, it turned without resistance, which meant the lock had been changed and then changed back. Someone had been inside, not a burglar. The alarm wasn't tripped. Someone with a code. A week after that, I got a call from my bank. A woman named Sandra at the branch I had used for 20 years. She sounded careful when she spoke. She told me that someone had called to inquire about the possibility of adding a signatory to my accounts, that they had claimed to be acting on my behalf, that she had declined to provide any information because the caller could not verify the proper credentials, but she thought I should know. I sat very still on the phone. The kitchen was quiet. A bird was doing something at the feeder outside the window. I thanked Sandra. I hung up. And I understood that the apology at dinner had been a false calm, and that the maneuvering had simply moved to a less visible level. Everything broke open on a Thursday night in November. I had hosted a small Thanksgiving dinner, just a few neighbors, Eleanor Marsh's associate who had become a friend, and Marcus and Dana, who had flown in from Portland. Julian and Tiffany were spending the holiday with her family in Darien, which was fine, or at least I said it was fine. We had a good dinner. The house was warm. Somebody brought a pie from a bakery in town that was genuinely extraordinary. After dinner, Marcus and I sat in the study with coffee. Dana had gone upstairs to call her mother. The house was quiet in that particular way that follows a table full of people and food and noise. Marcus asked me how things really were, not the surface version, the real version. I told him about the locksmith card, about the phone call from the bank, about the financial documents I had spent the previous 2 months quietly organizing with Eleanor's help. I told him I had begun to suspect that Julian, or more precisely Tiffany acting through Julian, had found a way to access some of my financial records through Catherine's estate documents, which Julian still held in his role as co-executor, that someone had been building a picture of my assets, quietly, over several months. Marcus put his coffee cup down carefully. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "Dad, you need to make some changes before they do." He was right, and I already knew it. I had already begun. I had, in the previous 6 weeks, done 4 things with Eleanor's guidance. First, I had removed Julian as co-executor of the remaining estate documents, and filed the appropriate paperwork with the probate court to transfer those responsibilities. Second, I had moved my primary accounts to a different institution entirely. Third, I had had a full appraisal done on the Greenwich property and had reviewed every recorded document related to its title history with a real estate attorney who confirmed that my ownership was clean and unchallenged. And fourth, and this is the part I had not told anyone yet, not even Marcus, I had 3 weeks earlier quietly made a change to my estate documents. I'm not going to be dramatic about this part, because it wasn't dramatic when I did it. I sat in Eleanor's office on a Tuesday afternoon with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and I signed the documents, and it was done. The house, the accounts, the investments, all restructured. Julian received what Catherine had wanted him to receive. Marcus received what I had decided he would receive, and a charitable remainder was established for an environmental organization Marcus had worked with. It was orderly. It was correct. And I felt when I signed, not revenge, but something closer to clarity. The events of the following month moved fast. Julian discovered, through the probate court filing, that he had been removed as co-executor. He called me. I did not answer. He called 3 more times. Then Tiffany called once in a tone that was no longer reasonable, but was still performing reasonableness, which was somehow worse. She said that I was being reactive and that I was going to damage the family. I let the call go to voicemail. I listened to it twice. I saved it. Then came the evening I will not forget. The snow had been falling for about 4 hours. Not a storm exactly, just a steady, quiet accumulation that made everything soft. Julian came to the house unannounced. He rang the bell. I opened the door. He was in his car coat, the collar turned up, snow on his shoulders. He looked for a moment like a man who had driven a long way and wasn't entirely sure why. And then the look passed, and what replaced it was something harder, something I recognized because I had watched it form over years of Tiffany's careful influence and Julian's own need to be certain, to be the one who controlled the shape of things. He said that I was making things very difficult, that I was alienating the entire family, that Tiffany's parents had been kind enough to suggest a very comfortable arrangement in a community near their place in Darien, and that I was being irrational to refuse, that I had always been difficult, actually, controlling, unwilling to compromise, and that Catherine had spent years managing my stubbornness, and now that she was gone, there was no buffer anymore. I stood in the doorway. The snow was coming down. My house was warm behind me. He said, "I think it would be better for everyone if you made other arrangements. I think it's time." I looked at my son. I looked at the snow falling past the porch light, and I said, "I see." 2 words. That was all. He waited for something else. For a fight, maybe, or an argument that would give him something to push back against. I didn't give him one. I stepped back inside. I closed the door. The next morning, I called Eleanor and told her I was ready to make one more change. I took a week to arrange my affairs. I moved what I needed to move, confirmed what needed to be confirmed, and then I packed 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, and I drove to a furnished apartment I had rented in New Haven, near the waterfront, where I had grown up. I had paid 6 months in advance. The rooms were modest and clean, and they looked out over the water, and I sat on the narrow balcony my first evening there with a glass of water and watched the harbour lights come on one by one in the dark. I was 63 years old. I had been pushed out of my home by my son and his wife, and I had left on my own terms with every document in order, and I had not said a single thing I would regret. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I want you to understand that what came next, the 10 years, the silence, the choices I made, were not the actions of a man who had given up. They were the actions of a man who had decided to live his life the only way he knew how to live it, with intention. I settled into New Haven carefully. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building near the harbour, 2 bedrooms, good light in the morning. I unpacked my books first, then my clothes, then the cardboard box which contained, among other things, a photograph of Catherine from our first year of marriage, a small wooden bird Marcus had carved for me when he was 12, and my father's watch, which I wound every Sunday morning. I found a routine. I walked every morning along the waterfront. I joined a civic organization that worked on housing issues for elderly residents, an irony I did not miss. I had coffee twice a week with a retired federal judge named Robert Chen, who had a gift for conversation and a complete disregard for self-pity, which I found refreshing. I kept in touch with Marcus by phone every week, and twice a year he and Dana would fly out, and we would spend a long weekend together, cooking dinners, walking along the water, talking the way fathers and adult children talk when they have found their way to honesty. I did not contact Julian. Julian did not contact me. For the first year, I thought about him every day. For the second year, most days. By the third year, I thought about him the way you think about an old injury. Not constantly, but whenever the weather changed. I learned through Marcus the broad outlines of Julian's life. He and Tiffany had moved into the Greenwich house, as I had suspected was always the plan. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, who would be my grandchildren, though I had never met them. The consulting firm Julian had started in his early 30s was doing well. Tiffany sat on several charitable boards. They were, by all visible measures, thriving. What Marcus could not have known, what nobody in my immediate circle knew, was that I had been, for the previous 3 years, watching Julian's business more carefully than Julian himself was watching it. Let me explain how that happened. When I sold my own consulting firm some years earlier, I had retained an interest in a related partnership that over time had grown into something much more substantial than I had anticipated. This partnership had investments across several sectors, including commercial real estate, and a small fund that made bridge loans to mid-sized businesses during transitional periods. I was not deeply involved in the day-to-day management, but I sat on the advisory board and I reviewed the quarterly reports, and I attended 2 meetings a year in Hartford. In the 5th year after I had left Greenwich, a name appeared in one of those quarterly reports. Julian Whitfield, Whitfield Advisory Group, a bridge loan request for $450,000 secured against future revenue from a long-term contract with a real estate developer in Fairfield County. The loan was approved with standard terms. Before I even saw the report, I read that report 3 times. I set it down. I picked it up again. My son had borrowed money from a fund I was associated with. He didn't know I was associated with it. He didn't know I had any ongoing involvement in anything. As far as Julian was concerned, I was a retired man in a modest apartment, living on my pension and my savings, diminished and distant. That was fine. I had cultivated that impression carefully. I did not intervene in the loan. It was a legitimate transaction, properly structured, but I began from that point forward to follow Whitfield Advisory Group's financial trajectory with a level of attention that went considerably beyond anything the advisory board required of me. What I observed over the following 2 years was a series of business decisions that were each, individually, defensible, but which together constituted something that worried me deeply. Julian had taken the bridge loan and used it to expand aggressively into a market that was, in my professional judgment, showing early warning signs of a correction. He had extended contracts with the Fairfield developer without adequate due diligence on the developer's own financial stability, and he had, as of the most recent quarter, leveraged the Greenwich property, my former home, which was now in his name, to secure additional operating credit. The property was mortgaged. The business was overextended, and the Fairfield developer, as I discovered through a very brief and carefully worded conversation with a contact in the commercial real estate sector, was in serious trouble. I was 69 years old. I was sitting in my apartment in New Haven on a Tuesday evening, reading through documents I had no obligation to review, concerning a son who had ejected me from my home with contempt, and I was trying to determine whether I was going to let him walk into the catastrophe that was forming around him. I spent a week with that question. I talked to Robert Chen, not about the specifics, but about the general territory of it. He was 75 and he had seen many things, and he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Arthur, the question isn't whether he deserves your help. The question is who you want to be." That was the question. It always was. Here is what I knew by the summer of Julian's crisis with absolute certainty. The Fairfield developer, a company called Hargrove Development, had defaulted quietly on 2 commercial loans and was facing a lawsuit from a major contractor. This was not public information, but it was discoverable if you knew where to look and had spent 30 years knowing the right people. Hargrove had also been the primary counterparty on Julian's largest long-term contract, the one that had secured the bridge loan. If Hargrove collapsed, the contract revenue evaporated, the loan became immediately callable, the operating credit based on the Greenwich property would be reviewed, and Julian's firm would have approximately 60 to 90 days before insolvency forced his hand. The mortgage on the Greenwich property was $2,300,000. The firm had additional obligations of about $800,000. Total exposure, approximately $3,100,000. Julian's liquid assets, based on what I could reasonably estimate, were nowhere near sufficient to absorb it. He was going to lose the house. He was going to lose the firm. Tiffany's family would cover some of it, probably. They had resources. But Tiffany's family did not like losing, and they did not like their daughter being associated with failure, and I had reason to believe, from things Marcus had said carefully and partially over the years, that Tiffany's parents' patience with Julian had limits. I organized everything I knew into a set of documents, not for myself, for what came next. I reached out, through Eleanor Marsh, to a private financial restructuring firm in Hartford that I had worked with once in the late stages of my own firm's operations. The firm's senior partner was a man named Gerald Hoyt, careful, discreet, genuinely skilled. I met with Gerald in his office in early September. I laid out the situation. I told him who the subject was, who I was, and what I wanted to accomplish. He listened. He did not express surprise. People in his position seldom do. I told him I wanted to do two things. First, I wanted to purchase Julian's debt position from the partnership fund quietly, meaning the bridge loan, and restructure its terms in a way that would give Julian's firm additional runway without triggering the cascade that was otherwise coming. Second, I wanted to make a private introduction between Whitfield Advisory Group and a regional bank that had expressed, through a mutual contact, some interest in acquiring a well-positioned smaller advisory operation as part of a service expansion. This second piece was the important one. If the acquisition went through, Julian would receive a purchase price that would cover his obligations, preserve his reputation, and allow him and Tiffany to exit from the position they were in with their dignity intact, though reduced. They would lose the Greenwich house. It would need to be sold as part of the debt resolution, but they would not be ruined. Gerald asked me one question before he agreed to proceed. He said, "Does he know this is coming from you?" I said no. He asked if I intended to tell him. I thought about it for a moment. I said I didn't know yet. Gerald said, "All right, Arthur," and we shook hands, and it began. The morning I stood in that hallway outside the glass-walled office in Hartford, I had been there for 20 minutes before Julian arrived. I had not planned to be there. I had received a call the previous day from Gerald's office, who told me that Julian's meeting with the bank's acquisition team was confirmed for 10 o'clock, and that the initial terms were on the table and looked favorable. I had thanked them and hung up. And then I had sat in my apartment for about 2 hours, and then I had gotten in my car and driven to Hartford. I told myself I was just going to make sure things were proceeding correctly, but that wasn't entirely true. I think some part of me, the part that had grown up understanding that certain things needed to be witnessed, wanted to see my son's face when the crisis passed. I watched through the window. Julian was in the meeting for nearly 2 hours. At one point, he rubbed his face with both hands in a way that I recognized. He had done it as a child when he was working through something difficult. At another point, he leaned forward and asked a question, and whatever the answer was, something in his posture shifted. The executive across from him slid a document across the table. Julian read it twice. The meeting ended. People shook hands. Julian picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door. I moved down the hallway before he came out. I took the elevator to the lobby and was out on the street, in the September air, before he emerged from the building. I walked half a block and stopped at a corner and stood there. He came out a minute later. He stood on the sidewalk in his suit, the briefcase in one hand. He looked up at the sky, just for a second, and then he looked straight ahead, and he began to walk. He walked right past me, 4 feet, close enough that I could have said his name. I didn't. I watched him go. I watched him turn the corner. I stood on the sidewalk for another minute, and then I walked back to my car and drove home. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was something much quieter, much harder to name. A kind of sorrow that had made peace with itself. A recognition that love does not always require acknowledgement to be real. I had spent 30 years providing for a son who had, in the end, underestimated me in every way that mattered. And I had spent the previous 10 years building quietly, carefully, the capacity to do one more thing for him. Not for his gratitude, not so that he would know, just because I was his father, and because my father's watch was on my wrist, and because some things are simply what you do. What happened after that unfolded over 6 months. The acquisition of Whitfield Advisory Group was completed in late February. The purchase price was $2,400,000, less than Julian had hoped when he started the firm, more than he would have received had things gone the way they were heading. Whitfield Advisory became a division of a regional bank's financial services arm. Julian was retained as a senior director for a 3-year transition period, with a salary that was comfortable, if not extravagant, and a clear path to either staying within the organization or eventually leaving with a clean record and a respectable professional history. The Greenwich property was sold as part of the debt resolution process. A young family from Westchester bought it. I was told this by Eleanor, who had monitored the transaction. She said the family had 2 children and a dog and had been searching for 2 years. I thought about the oak tree in the front yard and the bay window on the 2nd floor and the paint on the front door, and I was glad it was going to be a family. Tiffany and Julian bought a house in a less expensive town. A good house, a nice neighborhood, something they could genuinely afford. Marcus told me, about a year after the acquisition, that Julian had been asking about me. Not dramatically, not in a confessional way, just asking in a measured, cautious way how I was doing. Marcus said he told Julian I was well. I did not receive a call from Julian. Not then. And I had made peace with that. What I had not fully anticipated was the letter. It arrived on a Monday in April, more than a year after the acquisition, handwritten on plain paper, in an envelope with no return address, though I knew immediately from the handwriting whose it was. I stood at my kitchen table and opened it and read it once, straight through without stopping. It was Julian's handwriting. Deliberate, controlled, the same handwriting he had used since he was a teenager. The letter was 2 pages. He did not open with an apology. He opened with a fact. He said he had found out, through the bank's legal documentation, that the original bridge loan had been restructured and that the new terms had been arranged through a third party. He said it had taken him another 6 months to trace who that third party was. He said when he found out, he had sat with it for a long time before writing. He wrote about the night on the steps in the snow. He wrote about it with precision, the cold, the porch light, the words he had said. He said he knew those words were wrong. He said he had known it for years, but had spent a long time building a mental structure that would allow him to believe otherwise, because it was easier, and because Tiffany had been very good at helping him construct that structure, and because he had been, for much of his adult life, someone who valued the appearance of rightness over its substance. He said he did not expect forgiveness. He said the letter wasn't about forgiveness exactly. He said the letter was about wanting me to know that he knew, that he understood what I had done, that he understood also what I had not done, which was to use those 10 years to position myself in a way that could have crushed him professionally, and chose instead to use them to quietly save him. He said he had a daughter named Claire, who was 8 years old, and a son named Thomas, who was 5, and that they didn't know their grandfather, and that he was writing to ask if that might change. He said that Tiffany had read the letter before he sent it, that she had not added to it, but that she had asked him to say that she understood now what she had done, and that she was sorry. He said he believed she meant it. He closed by saying that he loved me, that he had always loved me, even when he had been too afraid and too proud and too wrong-headed to show it. He said he signed it the way he signed letters to his father, Julian. I folded the letter and put it in the drawer where I kept the photograph of Catherine and my father's watch and Marcus's carved bird. I stood at the kitchen window for a while. The harbour was grey-green in the morning light. A gull was doing something purposeful near a piling. The coffee was still hot. I sat down and wrote back. It took me 3 drafts, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it correctly. I have always believed that some things, once said, cannot be unsaid, and so they deserve the time it takes to say them right. In the first draft I was too formal, almost legal, like I was responding to a business inquiry. In the second draft I was too emotional, too many sentences that were more about my own relief than about what Julian needed to hear. The third draft was about 3/4 of a page, and it said what needed to be said. I told him I had read his letter carefully. I told him that I was not going to pretend that the decade had been easy, because it hadn't been. I told him that some of what he had done, and some of what had been done with his knowledge and compliance, had hurt me in ways that I would not minimize. I told him that I had, during those years, worked very hard to keep that hurt from becoming something corrosive, because I had watched what bitterness did to people, and I had decided early on that I would not let it do that to me. I told him that I had known about the business situation earlier than he might have expected. I told him that what I had chosen to do was not a gift in the sentimental sense. It was not something I had done to hold over him. I had done it because it was the right thing to do, and because I had spent my whole life believing that a father's job does not end at any particular age or with any particular event, even an event as painful as the one we had. I told him that his children deserved a grandfather. I told him that I would like to meet them. I signed it Arthur, because that was my name, and because the question of what he called me now was one we could work out together, slowly, in whatever time we had. I mailed the letter on a Thursday morning and went for my walk along the harbour. The trees were beginning to show the first green of spring. Robert Chen was at his usual bench, reading the paper, and he looked up and said, "You look like a man who's done something significant." I said I had mailed a letter. He said, "That can be significant," and went back to his paper. The first time I met Claire and Thomas was on a Saturday in May. Julian and Tiffany drove up to New Haven. I had made a simple lunch. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would create pressure or expectation. I had put out a small pitcher of lemonade because I remembered that Julian, as a child, had always loved lemonade, and it seemed like the right thing to have. Thomas came through the door first and stopped in the entryway, assessing the situation with the complete seriousness of a 5-year-old encountering an unknown environment. Claire came in behind him and looked at me with Catherine's eyes, the same dark, quick intelligence, and said very directly, "Are you our grandfather?" I said yes. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "We have another grandfather in Darien. He gives very big presents." I said I probably would not be giving very big presents. She considered this. Then she said, "That's okay. Mom says you're different." I looked at Tiffany over Claire's head. Tiffany was watching me with a careful expression, the kind of expression someone wears when they know they owe someone something and are trying to figure out how to offer it. She looked older than I remembered, tired around the eyes in a way that suggested she had spent some time with herself over the past couple of years. I gave her a small nod. She gave one back. Julian was standing near the door. He was looking at me the way people look at something they thought they had lost and found again in a drawer, a little surprised it was still intact. He looked like his mother around the eyes, and he looked like me around the jaw, and he looked like himself in the way that only grown children can, all the accumulated years of a life layered over the face you'd watched since birth. I said, "Come in. There's lemonade." He came in. We sat down. Thomas eventually climbed onto my couch and began examining the wooden bird that Marcus had carved, turning it over in his hands with deep concentration. Claire asked 17 questions about the harbour. Tiffany helped me carry things from the kitchen, and we stood side by side at the counter for a moment in an ordinary silence that felt, after everything, like something close to grace. Marcus flew out from Portland 3 weeks later. He had known the broad shape of what I had done. I had told him after the letter most of it. He had been quiet for a long time on the phone, and then he had said, "I'm not surprised, Dad. You've never been able to help yourself." He meant it kindly. He meant it in the way of someone who has known you long enough to understand that who you are is inseparable from what you do. He came to New Haven, and we walked along the harbour for about 2 hours. It was a warm June morning, the kind that makes New England feel like a promise. He told me about a project he was working on, watershed restoration, something he was proud of. I told him about Claire's 17 questions, and Thomas and the wooden bird. He laughed in the way he had always laughed, quietly, with his whole face. At some point he asked me if I was happy. I thought about it. I told him that happy might not be quite the right word, that I was at peace, that I had spent a great deal of my life building things, the firm, the house, the family, and that the most important thing I had built, it turned out, was something internal, a sense of who I was that didn't depend on external recognition, and that this had taken longer than it should have and had cost more than it should have, but that I had it now, and it felt solid in a way that other things hadn't. He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment, the way men do when words would be too much. We kept walking. That afternoon, we drove up to Vermont. I had kept the lake house. It had never been in dispute. It was in a separate trust that Catherine and I had set up years earlier, and the only people who ever knew the details were Eleanor and the trust's trustees. Marcus and I had spent several long weekends there over the years, and it remained the most peaceful place I knew. 3 bedrooms, a porch facing the water, an old aluminum canoe that needed patching every spring and which I patched every spring because some things are worth maintaining. We sat on the porch that evening. The lake was still. There was a line of pink light across the water from the setting sun. Marcus had his coffee. I had mine. The loons were out. There were 2 of them, doing whatever loons do in the early evening, which is to be entirely themselves, without any apparent concern for observers. I thought about the long, strange arc of the previous decade, the night in the snow, the apartment in New Haven, the documents organized quietly in Eleanor's office, the hallway in Hartford, the letter in my kitchen, Thomas with the wooden bird, Claire's dark eyes. I thought about my father's words, about looking your creditors in the eye, about what it meant to be a man who could do that. I thought about Catherine, who had loved Julian in a way that had unintentionally created the conditions for some of this, and who had also, in her own way, built something in Marcus that had held him together through all of it, and who had built something in me that I was still, at 73, learning the dimensions of. I thought about forgiveness. Not the theatrical kind, not the kind that makes a scene of itself, the quiet kind, the kind you arrive at through exhaustion and time, and the gradual understanding that carrying something heavy for long enough changes what you can carry. I had put down the weight. I didn't know exactly when. Somewhere in the years of walks along the waterfront, somewhere in the quarterly reports, somewhere in the choosing. It has been 2 years now since Julian's letter arrived. We see each other regularly. Not every week, not constantly, but enough. Claire has started calling me Grandpa Arthur, which she decided on herself and which I find completely acceptable. Thomas still brings the wooden bird out sometimes when we visit, turning it in his hands, and Marcus sends new ones periodically, small carvings that arrive in the mail in padded envelopes, which I put on the windowsill where the light catches them in the morning. Julian and I had a conversation about 8 months after the initial letter that I want to tell you about. We were at the lake house, just the two of us. Tiffany and the kids had gone into town. Marcus wasn't there. We were on the dock in the late afternoon, and Julian said out of nowhere, "Did you ever think about just letting it go, the business, I mean, when you found out?" I said, "I thought about it." He said, "What made you decide not to?" I sat with the question. The water was moving very slightly, that particular way it does when there's no wind, but something is happening underneath. I said, "Because it wasn't about whether you deserved help. It was about whether I was willing to be the kind of person who helps." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I wasted a lot of years being the wrong kind of person." I said, "You had time to correct it. Some people don't." He nodded. He looked at the water. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And this time, unlike the dinner years earlier, unlike the managed apology he'd offered when he came to the house, this time it sounded true. It sounded like something he had been carrying for a long time and was finally, carefully, setting down. I said, "I know," because I did. We sat there for another hour. We didn't talk about anything important. We talked about the canoe and whether it needed patching again, and what Thomas had said at breakfast. Ordinary things. The kinds of things that accumulate over time into a life. Tiffany has changed. I say this not to be generous, but because it's accurate. The fear that drove much of her earlier behavior, the social anxiety, the status consciousness, the need to protect what she had by eliminating what threatened it, has through the years and through the consequences been tempered by something more honest. She made a point once of saying directly to me that she had been wrong and that she had used Julian's relationship with his father as a tool for her own purposes, and that she understood now what that had cost everyone, including her own children. I accepted this. I believe she means to do better, and I think she is. Marcus and Julian have a relationship now that they didn't have before. This was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of everything. They had been so separated by childhood dynamics, by the favoritism, by the different trajectories, by the years of Julian's implicit dismissal of his quieter brother, that they had never developed the closeness that brothers can have. They are developing it now, slowly, through phone calls and a shared commitment to not wasting the time they have. Marcus came to Julian's daughter's school play last spring. Julian is going to Oregon in August. These are small things. They are also enormous. I want to say something before I finish about what I learned. Not advice, I'm not in the business of dispensing advice, but what I learned for myself through all of this. The first thing is that love is not the same as approval. I spent years in the middle of this story believing that my love for Julian was conditional on his recognizing me, on his treating me correctly, on his being what I hoped he would be. When he failed to do those things, I experienced it as a diminishment of love, and I had to work very hard, harder than I have admitted, to understand that the love itself had never moved. What had moved was my ability to access it without being crushed by the disappointment of its rejection. The second thing is that dignity is not given. It can't be taken either. What I had, walking out of that house in the snow with 2 suitcases, was every bit as much as what I had walking in with Catherine 30 years earlier, maybe more, because I had chosen it. The things you choose carry a different weight. than the things that simply happened to you. The third thing is that children are not their worst moments. Julian, at his worst, did things that hurt me in ways I will carry forever. He was also the boy who helped me paint the front door. He was both of those things, and he is both of those things, and the work of loving someone is holding all of that at once, without letting either part obliterate the other. And the fourth thing, the one I come back to most often when I'm sitting on the porch at the lake house in the early morning, watching the light come across the water, is that the story I thought I was living was not in the end the story I was actually living. I thought I was living a story of loss, of displacement, of being made small by the people I loved most. And those things happened. They were real. But that was not the whole story. The whole story was something else. The whole story was that I had, underneath everything, more resources than anyone had credited me with. Not just financial, but moral, emotional, something that has no clean name. And that those resources, deployed at the right moment in the right way, had done something that 10 years of anger and silence and distance never could have done. They had opened a door. I am 73 years old. I walk along the waterfront every morning. I wind my father's watch on Sundays. I have coffee with Robert Chen twice a week, and he is now 78 and has developed strongly held opinions about the loons on the lake, which he expresses whenever I tell him about them. I have a daughter-in-law who looks me in the eye now, and a son who calls me dad, and 2 grandchildren who are entirely themselves in a way that fills me with something I can only describe as awe. I have a son in Portland who has always known me and who will keep knowing me for as long as we have. And I have, somewhere in the quiet beneath all of it, the understanding that the most important thing a person can build in a life is not a house or a business or a reputation. It is the capacity to choose when choosing is hardest, the capacity to say, this is who I am, and I will act from that place, and whatever comes from that is something I can carry. The lake is quiet in the early morning. The loons are out. The coffee is hot. I am still here. Thanks for watching until the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. As a final reminder, this was a fictional dramatization for entertainment purposes only, and does not constitute legal, medical, or financial advice. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next story.